Okay, I have started with a green canvas. It was white, I just painted it green so I wasn't fighting against the white of the canvas. It's done in acrylic, just normal Liquitex Basics. I like the Liquitex Basics really well for mixing with the airbrush because they have a very flat finish. Some of the other paints, like the Liquitex Heavy Bodied, I can't talk, have a bit of a gloss to it, and so the airbrush doesn't seem to stick to it as well. This gives it a bit more grip, which I really like. I'm using a Frederick's Blue Label Ultra Smooth canvas so that I do get that really soft look with the airbrush. If you use a canvas that has a lot of tooth, the airbrush gets stuck or it kind of catches on some of those areas and you end up with a look that almost looks like dry brushing instead of airbrushing, with all those little dots showing through, which is not ideal. What I'm using in my airbrush is white, which is opaque. For most airbrush paints, and it will depend on which brand you're using, but for most airbrush paints, your white and your black are going to be your true opaque colors. Some of the other colors, at least with the Createx, will say that they're opaque, but they're not truly opaque. They're still pretty translucent in comparison to what you can get with the white or the black. So I'm using white. I have mixed a little bit of brown in there with it, but I'm going to have to put brown on top of the white altogether. But I'm using the white first to block in the light areas, and the reason for that is that so many of the other colors that I'm going to be using are very translucent. They're not going to show up good enough against the green. I didn't want to start with just a white canvas because having a base color helps me not to fight against the white of the canvas, which can sometimes be hard to cover up. You can see, although I have airbrushed a lot of white, you can still see some of that green through, and so it ends up building more depth that way. It's just a look that I prefer. I'm coming back through here with a tan color on top of the white because I don't want it to be glowing white. Notice how far away the airbrush is from the canvas. In this real-time clip, you can see, if you watch how my finger is moving, how it pulls back and it always pushes forward before I let up on the paint. That's really important to help keep your airbrush from clogging. If you only pull back on the nozzle, or there's a word for it there and I can't think of it, the little button guy. If you only pull back on it, the trigger, is that the word? I don't know. If you only pull back on it and then you drop it while you're pulling back, you end up clogging your airbrush really bad. So when you use that, you want to pull back and then push forward. And I do have an intro to airbrushing tutorial kind of thing that I had posted before that talks about that more, and I'll put a link to that in this video description because that's a really good thing to watch before this. It'll make this make a lot more sense. Now that I've blocked in my white, I'm coming back through with the brown. And I believe this brown says that it's opaque, but it's really not. But I'm using the brown to block in where the ground is going to go. And this is a little trail or path. It's really important that most of my lines on something like this, whether it be water or a road or anything like that, even if you're doing grass, you want any lines that you have going through there to be more horizontal than vertical. If you do a whole bunch of vertical lines or diagonal, you end up making it look like the road is kind of lopsided or tilted. So here I'm keeping everything mostly horizontal. And I'm going to come back through with several colors to build up my depth here. This can be a little bit scary because I'm looking at my reference photo and the reference photo has so much involved with the lights and the darks, which I call detail, but you still want to keep it soft. I'm keeping the airbrush very far away from the canvas and did not adjust my camera angle there so you can't see what I'm doing. The nice thing too when you're doing this, I have a bad habit of getting hot spots when I airbrush. I don't airbrush that often. I usually use it just for special effects, not for detail. And I have a bad habit of getting hot spots where there's like a heavy dot somewhere. When you're doing a blurry background, that doesn't even matter. You can easily cover that back up. Better defining these horizontal sections. Now, I couldn't tell in my reference photo. I'm not sure if it's bark on this trail or just little rocks and dirt. It's really hard to tell because it is blurry and out of focus. But I still want to follow the movement, again with these horizontal lines. Right now, it just looks like I'm scribbling. But I promise that's not what's happening. This is a really fun style to do when you're getting used to airbrushing when you're a beginner, because no matter what you do, like, you don't have to be good. It will come out still looking okay as long as you keep your airbrush away from the canvas. If you get too close and you start having too much detail, then that doesn't give you the blurry look. But a complete beginner, this is such a good thing for you guys to practice on layering and getting this look when you're learning how to use the airbrush. And long, awkward pause. I'm assuming I'm mixing paint. Well, you can't see what I'm doing because my camera angle is bad. I do have good news for you guys. I have gotten a new, it's actually a mic stand with a boom mic thing on it, attachment. So hopefully for future videos, I am going to have a much better camera angle. So thank you to all of you who are supporters on Patreon, because it's because of you that I was able to get that. So videos should start looking much better soon. But also, that new camera angle was able to help me avoid getting glare on my paintings, which is amazing, because here I can see the glare in the upper left-hand area of the canvas. And I found when I was doing the rest of this painting with the new mic stand instead of a tripod, I didn't have that glare. So I'm pretty excited about that, and I'm excited to show you guys those results. There is just so much layering when you do this style. And this background is a little bit more in-depth and busy than most of the blurry backgrounds that I do. You can actually do a simple blurry background in just a few minutes. I spent a few hours working on this one because I wanted every single thing to look like the photo, and there was just so much busyness going on. But don't worry, you won't have to listen to me talk for several hours. I did pause while I was working, so it all condensed down to about an hour. And probably mixing paint again. Exciting stuff. When I mix paint, what I usually do is take a spray bottle and I spray water into the airbrush itself, and then put just a few drops of actual paint. You want the consistency. If you're using Createx, Createx can be a little bit frustrating, especially for beginners to use, but you want the consistency to be about that of milk. So I'm using a lot more water than I am paint with that stuff. That paint is just so thick. If I ever put straight paint into that airbrush, it will clog almost instantly. It's just too thick to feed through there. If you're doing something like this and it's busy like this one is, you just keep layering until it looks good. I had so many points on this where I was like, I should just paint over the canvas and start over. But it's a part of the process. You just have to keep layering all these ugly bits together so that you get that depth in the finished painting. Now, there are other airbrush paints that you can use that are not likely to clog the airbrush. They're so much easier to work with. Calm Art is a really good one. The thing with Calm Art is it's made so that you can actually erase it, like if you're working on an illustration board, to pull out highlights, which is nice, but because I'm going to mix this in with painting, if I get water or anything like that on, or a drop of water on anything that I've already painted, it can pull some of that paint back off the canvas. With Createx, it's pretty much going to stay there, which for the way that I paint, it works better. The other thing that I like about Createx is it dries pretty flat, whereas the Calm Art has a bit of a shine to it. So like if I'm doing something like this for a colored pencil background, I don't want my background to be shiny and then the colored pencil to be more flat. So this, I do like how the Createx works with the methods that I use, but while you're learning, you can definitely try out some other brands of paint and see if that works better, because Createx can be frustrating when it clogs the airbrush and you have to keep pulling everything apart and cleaning it out and learning to get the right consistency of paint versus water. I've mixed black in with my brown. It's not straight black, there is brown in there, and the black will take over everything. So I used what brown was already in my airbrush and just put a little bit of black to darken that up. Now I can start building up the contrast. And I'm probably working below where the camera is. That is genius. I need to watch for that better. There we go, now we can see. But I'm just layering over on some of these. Now, I'm not trying to cover all of the brown or all of the white. I want to make sure that all of these colors show through in areas. And I do have a reference photo for this, which I am paying very close attention to. If you're trying to do a blurry background and you're using a reference photo that has a very detailed background with the harsh lines and it's not out of focus like you want, you can actually use Photoshop and put a filter over it. It's one of the blur filters, and you can see really easily how that would look blurred, which makes it a lot easier when you're painting. I was lucky. The reference photo that the customer provided me with for this painting, this is a commissioned piece. The reference photo was great. Already had that beautiful blurry out of focus background, so you get that 3D effect when it's finished. But if you don't have that available, normally what I do is just take any photo for a background that I'm trying on, I make that blurry, and then leave whatever's in the foreground sharp and in focus, and that will give you that 3D depth look. 3D look. See what happens when I talk too long? Now with the black, I'm being careful not to go too crazy with it. I know I'm going to need to go a lot darker on most of these areas, but I would rather go less here and come back and add more than go too dark. With the black, because it is so opaque, if I put it in too many areas and go too dark, I'm going to have to come back through with a lot of white to lighten that back up later. So it's much easier on me if I go more sparingly. When I do these blurry backgrounds, you'll see that I have a lot of areas that have more dots, not just lines all over the place. The dots give you kind of a sparkle to it. I don't know how to explain it, but I do it a lot and I really like that look. Right now there are 2 black dots that I can see, but when I go back later on and start working on the, oh hey look, I moved the camera angle that time. But when I work on the grass, you'll see that I add a lot of dots. Some of them are for the flowers, but some of them just add a really cool sparkle look to it. Now what I've done here, I drew out my corgi on a piece of tracing paper. And then once I painted my background with the green, I taped the tracing paper over the position I wanted him on the canvas. And then I used transfer paper to draw just the outline. I didn't bother with any of the details. I don't need that. I only drew the outline. And that way I don't waste a ton of time airbrushing something that I'm going to cover up later on. I do pull the airbrush paint over those lines a little bit because I would rather have it come inside a little bit than be missing spots when I do paint in the corgi. Some people will draw everything out and use Frisket, which is basically a giant piece of tape that you can cut out however you want, and you can cover stuff in your painting that way with that stuff. Like if I'm working in colored pencil, I'm going to either use Frisket or a masking tape to cover my subject, because that I can't get paint on, because you know with colored pencil that those are more transparent, and so if I get paint in the wrong area with that or the overspray, I'm not going to be able to cover it completely with the colored pencil. But here, because of the way paint layers, I don't really have to worry about it. If you get really comfortable with airbrushing, most of the artists I know who are really good with it don't really normally bother with Frisket or masking fluid or any of that. They don't need to. Personally with me, I am messy. I don't paint with it often enough that I have so much control that I can keep from having overspray all over the place, so I will almost always use Frisket in a case like that when I'm working in colored pencil. I'm coming through and adding highlights. Now what's going to happen, I need to come back through with kind of a reddish brown color, but that reddish brown is very transparent. It's not going to show up against all of the darker browns I have in there. So I'm taking the white and pulling in highlights. Then I can put the reddish brown over it and it'll pop out. The colors will stand out really well. That reddish brown is just too transparent and wouldn't show up against what I had already. Plus this is adding just that much more detail. If you look at the airbrush, you can see that I have removed the guard that was on the nozzle at the beginning of the video. That way, when the white paint especially, it likes to dry on the tip of the needle. And by removing that guard, I'm able to easily take my fingernails and scrape off the bits of dry paint that dry on the tip there. If you remove that guard, you have to be really careful though, because it's easy to bend or accidentally hit the airbrush on something and bend the tip of that needle, which will ruin it because it makes the paint kind of squirt out to the side at whatever angle the needle is bent. Those are replaceable, so if you do end up bending yours, you can get a new one just of the needle, but still you want to be real careful. Like when I stop airbrushing, I'll always put the guard back on. Now you'll notice on my airbrush, I don't have the cap on the gravity feed container thing. So when I move my hand too much, I can easily spill that paint that's in the airbrush. Really, yeah, I've made horrible messes that way. If you do have a lid for yours, it does help to use it, or the little cap on there, so that you don't make a mess and accidentally end up with splash marks where it shouldn't be. I don't know where mine is right now, so I'm just being or attempting to be more careful than normal. But I do recommend using that, putting that cap on when you're working, especially when you're learning, because it's so easy to have that splash onto your painting. And once that happens, it's really hard to hide that. It's like getting paint splatters all over. Another thing that I recommend when you're using the airbrush, I have a paper towel that you can't really see, but it's stored on my easel, and I test out my airbrush before I hit the canvas every single time. If I've been working on an area, it's fine, but every time I mix paint, I will test that out on the paper towel first, because it is so easy to have your airbrush get slightly clogged when you pause, and then when you go to paint on your canvas or paper, whatever it is that you're working on, have it spit all over the place. So I test on a spare piece of paper, or in this case a paper towel, just to make sure that the airbrush isn't clogged and isn't going to make a mess. But it's a really good habit to get into, doing that first before you hit the canvas. I have messed up so many things by not using that precaution in the past. Now I'm going to start working on the grass in the background, and I'm using white just because it's opaque. It's going to show up better. I will end up taking green over these, but right now I am just building up my little grassy sections. Again, not going too close because I want this to be very, very soft, and it's the edges that I need soft, the transition between one color to another. The harsher your lines are, the closer that object is going to appear to the viewer. So it is important. In this case, I don't want harsh lines. You want a hint that they're there. What I'm doing for the most part are what are called dagger strokes. There's the dots I was talking about. But when I'm doing the grass, I'm doing a lot of dagger strokes where the bottom is thicker, and then I move the airbrush slightly closer to the canvas towards the end so that each of those little strokes or blades of grass thin out. It's a good thing when you get an airbrush to practice those, starting with a thick base and then moving to a thin point. It just helps you learn control. It's one of the first things I learned to do when I was airbrushing. And this is another one of those really ugly stages where everything looks absolutely terrible, but I'm just building up the depth there. And it looks extra bad being white. Actually, the next layer is going to look extra bad because I have to use a very fluorescent light green, and it looks like I attacked my canvas with a highlighter. It looks terrible, but I have to build up all of these layers like this in order to get the depth that I need for the end result. That scratching and ticking sound that you're hearing, I have my hermit crabs are on my desk next to me, their tank is, and they don't actually quiet down when you ask them to. So I apologize for those weird scratchy noises. Must train my hermit crabs better. Now I'm getting a little bit more defined, paying close attention to my reference photo on what areas need to be a little bit more solid. Because you don't want these to all be even blades of grass. That will look very fake and very unnatural. These are just clumps of lights and darks. Having the corgi drawn in and not just painting over all of it and painting him on top also helped because it made it so that I was able to more easily look at my reference photo and tell what needed to go where. Like the grass starts around the shoulder blade, or up by the ear, that's where it changes from green to brown, things like that. So having that pre-drawn in, it definitely was a helpful guideline. Because these are so soft, I didn't want to draw in each blade of grass or each flower or anything like that, because those lines, even if I use a charcoal pencil, those lines would show through. So that's something that I need to freehand. And the corgi made a good guideline. You can see I'm coming through and better defining this the dirt path, whatever that is. I still don't know if it's dirt or bark. But I'm using the white, and it won't stay white. I will glaze other colors over it. But I need that opaque color on there first. And I'm probably mixing paint and forgot to pause the video. You are welcome. Oh no, I'm just off camera again. I did that a lot on this video. You're welcome. I am now coming through with green. Now, the greens that I have in most of my airbrush colors are crazy fluorescent. They are not natural colors of green. So what I found the easiest way to do, one, I can just mix the color. That is definitely an option. But an even easier way for me is to go ahead and use these fluorescent horrible colors, and then I will put a reddish brown over it, which neutralizes it. And that gives me even more depth because I have more layers. So this is the part I was talking about that looks like I attacked my canvas with a highlighter, and it's actually going to get worse when I come on with the yellows. And I will let little teeny areas of this fluorescent green and the yellow fluorescent green show through under the natural colors. Just in areas, and again, it just gives me that much more depth. And I can be very loose with this. I've already got pretty much most of the detail that I want with the grass with the white that I already did. So right now, I'm pretty much just being very, very messy and covering most of the white back up. I think this is one of the colors that claims it's opaque. It's not opaque at all. I guess it's more opaque than their translucent colors, but it's still pretty translucent itself. Mixing airbrush colors, you have a few options that you can go with. One is just to use the color that you want, and that makes everything easier. But the other way would be to mix in the airbrush itself, which is what I usually do because I'm lazy. But I put water first and then a couple of drops of whichever color that I need to go with. If you're not used to mixing colors, that can be a little bit difficult because you may end up with way too much green and you're trying to add yellow and the yellow is not going to lighten it up. If you don't know that green is a color that overpowers yellow, that can be hard. So an easier way to go, Hobby Lobby, and I think every art store is going to carry these little teeny vials, and you can mix your color in there, and that way you can mix a lot more than you need and save it in case you need that color again later. And even then you can add the water and have it all pre-mixed and evenly mixed so you don't end up with big clumps that end up clogging the airbrush. That's probably the best way to go, and I would do that myself if I was not lazy. And yep, mixing paint. This time I know I'm mixing paint because my backdrop moved. Behind the backdrop is where I have a big dresser thing full of drawers that I store all of my paint in. Well, this is exciting. I should have edited this section out. Oh gosh, how long am I mixing paint now? There we go. Now I'm coming through with that yellow-green color that I was talking about. Again, looks like a highlighter. This is a very translucent paint. I'm not worrying about blades of grass or any of that. I'm just going over everything. Well, except for the brown. This was kind of a scary stage because even though I knew it's what I needed it to look like, it looks so horrible. So when you're painting, you need to expect to have these really ugly stages. It's totally normal and part of the painting process. Don't let it make you give up. Because honestly, at this stage, had I not known that where this was going to end up, I probably would have just started over. There were several times that it looked so bad where I was thinking, oh my gosh, maybe I should just work again. Now I'm coming through with, I've added a little bit of a reddish brown into that color, and what that's going to do is give me a more neutral kind of brownish green color that I need in a lot of this background. And it looks like I'm blending color again, or mixing color. Okay, now I'm coming through with a much more natural green and starting to get some of the colors that fall in between these blades of grass. I'm sort of doing a reverse painting at this point where I'm getting in between the grass that's in the foreground. I'm painting the stuff that's in the background. The reason that I didn't do dark green first is those colors with the brighter green are so translucent that it wouldn't have covered up the dark green. So it was easier to do my light colors first and then put the dark colors in between those little blades of grass to define the shapes better. The biggest thing that you'll want to take from this video, if you're airbrushing your backgrounds, look how far away from that canvas my airbrush is. The closer you are, the sharper your lines are going to be, which is not what you want for this look. Normally, every time you see me pause, it's because I'm looking up at my reference photo. Constantly check your reference photo. Horrible glare there. So excited about the new well, it's not really tripod, mic stand that I'm using as a tripod for the camera angles to avoid that glare in the future. I had no idea that avoiding the glare was going to be an added bonus with it, switching from the regular tripod. I can get such better camera angles with that. Very slowly building this up. And I am going extra slow. When I use the light colors, I was a lot messier. But when I'm putting these darker colors in, because they are a lot harder to cover up, I can cover them up by putting white and then the green on top. But to avoid having to do too much of that, it's better just to work slow and be careful about where I'm putting these darker greens. Another thing when doing this, I will continuously pause the camera and back up and compare my reference photo to what I'm working on at a distance. Another thing that I do a lot when doing, and I do this for pretty much anything I paint or draw, but I'll take a photograph of what it is that I'm working on and import it into Photoshop and put it right next to my reference photo. It is so much easier to see where you're off on a photo when you compare them smaller like that on a computer screen. Looking side by side, you just see everything that you didn't see before. That line, I got too heavy, I got too close to the canvas, and there was so much water mixed in with my paint that it just left a heavy line. So I just dabbed my finger to soften it up, and I will end up covering that up with other things later. Yeah, I'm rubbing that area out with a dry paintbrush. Now I'll go try that again with a much softer look. You have to watch, because if you pull back the trigger on that airbrush too far and you have too much paint and too much air come out at the same time, you get these splatter things like what I just had happen. So definitely be careful. Don't go too crazy with pulling that trigger back too far. Work slow. I've mixed black in with that green to darken it up even more, but it's not flat black. Very rarely when I'm working with an airbrush will I use flat black. I usually mix another color in with it, and then I end up glazing other colors on top of it later. That way I get a lot more depth than if I just use black. Now my greens are still way too fluorescent and stand out too much, and I'll come back and tone those down still later. But now I'm just getting in my darker values. This whole area that I'm working on now is not that important because most of it doesn't show through once I put the flowers in, so I've kind of rushed over that area, just so I have a little bit of brown that'll show through. Now I'm starting to put some of the areas that are much heavier with the shadows. If you want a thicker line with the airbrush, you hold the airbrush further away from the canvas. For smaller, finer lines, you get closer to the canvas. So when I'm covering, it's not just about covering a large area, it's about having a very soft airbrushed area. I'll pull the airbrush even farther back, and that was way too bright yellow. I'm adding the little highlighted areas now. These are some of the dots that I was talking about. Now some of this is just highlighting the grass spots. This is yellow, well, it's mostly white with a bit of yellow mixed in. And I'm also going to be using this color to add some of the wildflowers that are in the background. These dots are flowers. Now I'm just getting the highlights on the grass. You don't want all of these lines the same width or the same size. It'll look really unnatural. In this case where I'm trying to get grass, I want variation. That is super important. Oh my gosh, tiny crab, you're making too much noise. And now these dots, some of them are where the wildflowers are, and some are just light highlights in the background that help give me depth. I have to be careful with this because the color that I'm using right now is so opaque. It's really easy to pull back too far on that trigger and have this paint just squirt out all over the place. So I'm working really slow and being very careful. When I'm using a transparent color, I'm pretty messy with it and loose, but with these opaque colors, you really want to be careful. Now, towards the front here, these ones I start adding a little bit more detail, but I'm still keeping the ones in the background very soft. And that again just helps me to build depth in the piece. I don't want all of the background the same level of blurriness. It's going to have a little bit more detail as it comes forward. In this case, if I were to put the same amount of detail in the foreground or up closer that I do in the very far background, it just looks like I have two separate layers, which is not the end look that I want. So by adding that little bit of detail as I move forward, mostly on the pathway, a little bit on the grass, that will help it look like it all belongs together instead of being two separate paintings. Now with this paint, when I first put it on, because of it being when it's wet and the way that the light reflects on that, it'll look like the areas are really bright and way too shiny. When it dries, it ends up, when the light's no longer, you're not getting the reflection there anymore. A lot of these dots that I'm doing tone down to where they're not quite as harsh. And it's not really that they're changing color as they dry, it's just because they're so reflective when they're wet. A few more highlights on my dirt path or whatever it is. And off camera again, I was just amazing at doing that this time. I'm sorry. It wasn't too exciting. Don't feel like you're missing out on much. It's the same thing that I'm doing now, just in that bottom corner. And I'm using straight white now just to pull out a few more highlights. Now you do have to change the color every single time and clean the airbrush every time you switch colors. That didn't sound right. Of course you have to change colors when you change colors. But you have to run, I usually run water or a cleanser through my airbrush. There's one made by Createx that I really like, in between colors. And so what I do is when I've got white in the airbrush, anywhere I could possibly add white or I might need white, I'm going to do now. Whereas when I'm painting normally, I switch colors constantly. Here, I try to get as much done as I can with each color that I currently have in my airbrush. And those are blurry flowers right there. Now I'm putting in one of the dandelions in the background. Now my reference photo didn't have dandelions in the foreground, but being that I had them in the background, I went ahead and put some in the foreground, which helped kind of balance it out, which makes it more obvious that those are dandelions in the blurred area in the background instead of just a white glob. By having them in the foreground, which again you can't see yet, but when I put them in the foreground, it made it really obvious that when you looked at the canvas, the viewer was going to know that in the background that's what those were. I don't know if that makes any sense. It'll make more sense next week. Now I am just using white anywhere that I'm going to need a flower, and I'm going to put the color that I need on top of that after. But the magenta colors, or kind of a violet lavender color that I'm going to need for some of these pinkish flowers, those colors are extremely translucent. So if I were to just put that color straight on the canvas, they wouldn't show up. So by doing it white first, that gives a good base for those colors. Now this is another area that I'm really glad I drew the corgi out first and didn't just randomly paint over it like I sometimes do. Doing this let me know where to put those flowers so they weren't just coming out of the side of the head weird. It gave me a much better balance and kind of a guideline on where I should put those flowers in order to keep the balance of the overall piece. Adding a little bit of white down here, being that I already have it in my airbrush. Now on some of this, it looks like I'm coming at the canvas at an angle, and I'm not. You really want your airbrush to be straight at the canvas. Here it's obvious that it's straight, but when I change positions, it looks like I'm coming at a really sharp angle to the canvas, and that is not how you generally want to airbrush. You really want to have your airbrush pointed straight at the canvas. Here I am coming on straight. It just weird angle with the camera, you can't tell. So don't think that I'm coming at a harsh angle. That is not something that you want to do. If you're airbrushing indoors, I cannot stress this point enough, wear a mask, because this airbrush paint, as you're doing it, you don't realize how much of that ends up floating in the air. And if you breathe that in, there was a time several years ago, that I airbrushed and I looked across the room. I was airbrushing in my living room and I looked across the room and I just had this cloud of airbrush paint all over the place. And when it goes in a room, it's not a big deal. It's not going to damage anything. It just dusts right off. You end up with a film on all of your furniture, but it dusts right off, no problem, because it's dry when it lands. But if you're not wearing a mask and you're breathing that in, it coats your lungs and it makes it so that you're not getting the oxygen that you need. And so I made myself really sick doing that. I learned my lesson. I wear a mask now. I hate wearing those masks. They're so uncomfortable, but it's a lot more uncomfortable when you're not getting oxygen. I speak from experience. Some people paint in their garage or somewhere where they've got a lot of airflow. There, it's not as big of a deal to wear a mask. I probably still would, just because I'm paranoid after my experience. But if you're indoors, even with a ceiling fan going or something like that, you still want to wear a mask. And opening one window is not enough to get the air moving enough. Or at least not enough that you can use that as a reason not to wear a mask. I would also not recommend using this in a room where you have any birds. Birds are extremely sensitive to that sort of thing because they have air sacs. So even though the paint itself is non-toxic, it would really probably kill a bird pretty quickly. So definitely do not use this in the same room with a bird. Even with my dogs, if they're in the room with me, they're usually under the blanket. So that I feel a little bit safer about. But if I had a dog that was just laying on the floor and breathing open air, I would put the dog in another room because it's the same thing with the dog. You don't want them breathing in that paint. Luckily, studio assistants 1 and 2 think that they need to sleep with their head, or their whole body and head under the blankets, so that works as a mask enough for them. I'm using a reddish brown color now over some of the white areas that I used on the brown. And a hairdryer because I had too much water in there. And that's something you want to watch too. If you're using a lot of water in your paint, if there's enough water that it starts to run, you've got too much water. Again, you want the consistency of milk. And this reddish brown, it's extremely transparent, and so I'm able to go over the black areas too, which help the black areas not to look so flat and black. I must have had a lot of water in that area if it's taking that long to dry with the hairdryer. Everybody needs a pink hairdryer for their paintings. Now this reddish brown that I'm using, I end up coming back through and pulling that into a lot of the green areas of the grass, and that helps to neutralize that color so that they're not so bold highlighter green in your face. The more water that you add to your mixture, the more transparent it is. It's more likely to run, but it's also a lot more transparent, so keep that in mind when you're adding water. And the more water you add, the less adhesive that paint is. Now once you varnish or seal a painting, then you don't have to worry about it. But while you're painting, that can be an issue. So if I were to layer, like that area I just did with the reddish brown, if I layer acrylic paint over that, that reddish brown is just going to pull off. I have so much water there, it's not really going to stick to the canvas by putting that on there. Again, once it's sealed with a varnish, I use the spray varnish over anywhere I've airbrushed, then I don't have to worry about it at all. Then it's permanent. But while you're working, that is something that you want to be aware of. And if you're using Calm Art instead of Createx, all of that will lift if you put water on it. At this point, again, I'm just taking that reddish brown and going over a lot of that green. And the reason that reddish brown is neutralizing the green, it's not that I'm just putting brown over the green. It's because of the red tone in there. Red is a complementary color to green. If you mix a color with its complement, it's going to neutralize it. So in this case where my green's like, whoa, that is fluorescent green in your face, to neutralize it, I add a reddish tone over it. And that's going to be whether you're airbrushing or you're working in acrylic or oil paint, or even if you're working in colored pencil. You can neutralize a color by adding its complementary color. If you're not familiar with complementary colors, that is the color that is opposite a color on the color wheel. And so having a color wheel is a little bit handy, so if you forget, that will help you. But yellow and purple are going to neutralize each other and give you a brownish, a nice earthy brownish tone. Orange and blue will do the same. Orange and blue is a little bit different because it's really easy in using that to end up with green instead of brown, so it depends on if it's a warm blue or a cold blue. There's more involved than that. But that is why in this case where I've got that fluorescent green, I'm neutralizing it by putting a reddish tone over it. Now, red is one of the colors in the airbrushing paint that is really pretty opaque, so I don't want to use red. In this case, that reddish brown is the ideal choice for the look that I'm trying to get. I'm better defining some of these flowers, and the color that I'm adding on now is a very pale lavender color, but it looks white. It's picking up white on here, so I will come back through with a more magenta color. And the nice thing in that case, by having the two tones, this light pink that looks white right now, and then having a second area with this magenta that I'm going to add, it just adds that much more depth. They're not just one flat circle of one color. So now they're starting to have more of the pink tone, but I'm still going to come back through with the darker color over parts of it. I'm not going to cover all of it, just sections of it, and it makes it look like you've added shading by pretty much just putting a dot. Really, really easy. I love doing this blurry background because while it may seem like it's a little bit time consuming sometimes because I do so many layers, it just looks so good when you get to the end result. Mixing color again. I really need to work on the editing. There we go with that darker magenta color. And you can see just putting those little dots and the shadow on the bottom, it looks like I just did all this work and it's like one little thing. Now these final details of these wildflowers, now that they're coming together, it makes the whole background make a whole lot more sense. When I was starting off, it just looked like globs of green and globs of brown, but now it actually looks like something. And I think that's important when you do a lot of the blurry backgrounds. If you've got trees and such in the back, you still want to make sure that the branches look like they're moving in the shape of branches. Don't just put random lines everywhere. Have more of a purpose in what you're doing. I'm now coming back through and just adding those final little touches, those final details. It's so easy sometimes to think, okay, close enough, I'm done. But if you just spend that extra time, I'll usually take a break, walk away from my canvas or my paper, whatever it is I'm working on, walk away, get some tea or whatever. Just take a break, rest your eyes, and then come back and look at where you need those highlights. This is another area where I like to take a photo and import it into Photoshop and put it next to the other one, or the reference photo like I was talking about, and see what looks different. Are my greens too green? In this case, my greens are too green and I need to tone them down a little bit, and I will get to that in a second. But this is where you really start paying attention to those little details. Here I'm adding in a few of those finer details that are closer to the camera. And I'm really paying more attention to my color values. Now I can adjust those a bit because I will be going over this with a couple of glazes of oil, but you still want to make sure at this point, if you're only working with the airbrush paint, watch your colors now. This is where it's really easy to change it. Now, if I'm working in colored pencil, I will regularly go over those in colored pencil. Colored pencil sticks to this really, really well. So you can adjust your colors some, but still pay attention to what you're doing. The more you get done with this, the easier it'll be for you later on. More of those little glowy dots. Technical term there. And some of my areas that were just white lines are a bit too white, and I'm covering that with some of the yellow. And the yellow that I'm using there is kind of an orangey yellow. More details with white. And this is after I've taken that break, stepped away from the canvas, and so I'm able to more easily see, okay, I was too dark here. I need to lighten this up. And yeah, I can come back and do it later with the oil paint, but it's so much easier to get that done now. Mainly because this dries so fast. The oil, if I lighten it up with the oil, I'm going to have to let it dry before I put glazes over it. With acrylic, you can just keep, or with airbrushing, you can just keep layering on top of a layer. It dries almost instantly. The more water you add, the longer it takes, but with a hairdryer, you can make it dry really fast. By having some of those areas a lot darker farther away on this little path, it pushes that back. It gives me more depth. You can see here, I'm getting a little bit closer to the canvas, getting a little bit more detail. And keeping it softer as I move farther away from the viewer. And this is one of those things. I could have gotten this whole bottom section finished completely before I did the grass and before I did all of the other things. But for me, it's easier for me to jump around because now I can judge my values. I can see where things need to have more detail or they need to be softened out. It's just a lot easier for me that way. But some artists do like to work in one area until it's 100% finished and then move on to the next. That is completely up to you with whichever way makes more sense. I think our brains all work a little bit different. There's no one right or wrong way. I'm adding a few more details back behind that little clump of grass so that it's not too harsh between being overly blurred and then a little too much detail up front. I want that to fade softly. You can see I'm taking a lot more time on these little areas that I'm adding in. When I first started this, you notice how quickly I was moving through everything, being very messy, very rushed, wasn't worrying about anything. Now it matters. Now if I accidentally move too fast and splatter paint all over, or if I just get a heavy line where I don't want it, it's going to take me way too long to fix, so I really want to be careful towards these final steps. And once you've done a few of these paintings, you'll get to where you realize on your own where you need to take the time and where you can rush through. And that takes a few paintings before you get the hang of that. But if right now you feel kind of lost and you're like, I don't know where I need to take the time, that comes with time. Or practice. Whatever. I feel like I'm rambling. I hope some of what I'm saying is making sense to you guys. At least there's a mute button, so don't feel too bad about talking for an hour. More of these teeny tiny details. And that white line was a little bit too harsh. I'll have to come back later and soften that up with another color. No, as it dried, it looked like it was okay. So again, this is where that paint, when it goes on and it's wet, the way that the light reflects on it, it'll make it look like things are they stand out too much, but once it dries, they're really not that much. And even though I'm doing the soft shading, or the soft lines and painting, I'm still adding shadows and highlights. That still matters. They're just not harsh shadows and highlights. But like you saw where I was doing the dandelions, I highlighted one side of the stem. I just kept the airbrush back far enough that it wasn't a sharp line between the light and the dark. I'm glazing a color over it's kind of an orangey red color over the pathway. So those areas that were white, they're not staying white. I'm toning them down, but I needed to put them in there so that when I came back through with this translucent color that they would show up. If I just put that translucent color over the brown by itself, you wouldn't see anything. I don't even think it would have made a big difference in tinting the color, let alone pulling out highlights. In the same color, I will go over some of the greens, again to neutralize them some, because they're still pretty bright green. Especially in the back, I really wanted to tone down some of those. Now this piece is a little weird because normally if you use a lot of yellow in the background, it makes it appear like it's a lot closer than it is. You want to keep your yellow and warmer tones look better if they're up front and you use cooler tones in the background. But for this one, because the corgi was sitting in a grassy area, you're just going to have a lot of these yellows and that glow. So I really needed to make sure that that stayed very, very soft where I'm putting that yellow so it does appear that it's far away, because there's a couple of ways that you can achieve the depth. One is by the colors that you choose, and the other is by how harsh your details are. So I'm having to really depend on keeping those areas soft, being that I did choose to stay with those yellow tones. Cooler tones are generally going to make it look like it's farther away. I'm using a brownish tone to add a bit more shading. And that's just brown mixed in with that yellowy orange color I had. It's a very muddy color, but it works up against the greens. In this case, you'll notice too that I'm making sure that I've got areas that are darker farther away, like the area I'm working right now, from that clump of grass that's right in front of it. You want to make sure that you have these separate zones so it does look like you've got depth and not just random lines all over the place. Define your clumps of grass when you're doing grass. Same thing when you're doing trees or bushes. Have definite clumps where different branches are or leaves. And a lot of people ask if they can just use a single action airbrush to get this sort of blending. You don't have enough control, so I still don't think the single action is going to get this look for you, even close to this look really. If you want to do this type of look with the airbrush, then having a dual action is pretty important. But it gets a really nice result, and luckily if you get a good airbrush and good air compressor, they last a really long time. I've been using my same one for, gosh, I want to say 17, 18 years. It's pretty old, and I've only had to replace a few hoses on the compressor. If you get something that's good, then it will last you a very, very long time. And I hope that little tutorial helps you guys out in understanding better how I get my blurry backgrounds.